Okay, cool. I'm doing the last part of chapter 25, which is only 8 pages, but it's a very long 8 pages. Very sad. That's okay. I think it's a lot of the art stuff. Yeah, I think it's like the fiction and the art and the... Oh my god, there's so much fiction and art in business. Okay. Starting on page 564, prohibiting alcohol and promoting reform. I have a soda with me, but it's not a lot, and it might run out, and I'm sad. Prohibiting alcohol and promoting reform. Alarming gains by Demon Rum spurred the temperance reformers to redoubled zeal. Especially obnoxious to them was the shutter-doored corner saloon, appropriately called the Poor Man's Club. The barroom helped keep both him and his family poor. Liquor consumption had increased during the nerve-wracking days of the Civil War, and immigrant groups accustomed to alcohol in the old country were hostile to restraints. Whiskey-loving foreigners in Boston would rudely hiss temperance lecturers. Many tipplers charged, with some accuracy, that temperance reform amounted to a middle-class assault on working-class lifestyles. The National Prohibition Party, organized in 1869, pulled a sprinkling of votes in some of the ensuing presidential elections. Among the favorite songs of these sober souls were "I'll marry no man if he drinks," "Vote down the vile traffic," and "The drunkard's doom." Typical was this: "Now, all young men, a warning take, and shun the poisoned bowl. 'Twill lead you down the hell's dark gate, and ruin your own soul." Militant women entered the alcoholic arena, notably when the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, was organized in 1874. The white ribbon was its symbol of purity. The saintly Frances E. Willard, as champion of Planned Parenthood, was its leading spirit. Less saintly was the muscular and mentally deranged Kansas Cyclone, Carrie A. Nation, whose first husband had died of alcoholism. With her hatchet, she boldly smashed saloon bottles and bars, and her hatchetations brought considerable disrepute to the Prohibition movement because of the violence of her one-woman crusade. But rum was now on the run. The Potential Anti-Saloon League was formed in 1893, with its members singing, "The saloon must go, and vote for cold water, boys." Female supporters sang, "The lips that touch liquor must never touch mine." Statewide prohibition, which had made surprising gains in Maine and elsewhere before the Civil War, was sweeping new states into the dry column. The great triumph, but only a temporary one, came in 1919, when the National Prohibition Amendment, 18th, was attached to the Constitution. Banners of other social crusaders were aloft. The American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, ASPCA, was created in 1866 after its founder had witnessed brutality to horses in Russia. The American Red Cross was launched in 1881 with the dynamic and diminutive 5-foot-tall Clara Barton, the angel of Civil War battlefields, at the helm. Post-war fiction, lowbrow anti... Dropped my mic. Not all social activity proved so serious. Post-Civil War, Americans devoured millions of dime novels, usually depicting the wilds of the woolly West. Paint-bedaubed Indians and quick-triggered gunmen like Deadwood Dick shot off vast quantities of powder, and virtue invariably triumphed. These lurid paperbacks were frowned upon by parents, but goggle-eyed youths read them from in haylofts or in schools behind the broad covers of geography books. The king of the dime novelist was Harlan P. Halsey, who made a fortune by dashing off about 650 pot boilers, often in one day. General Lew Wallace, lawyer, soldier, and author, was a colorful figure. Having fought with distinction in the Civil War, he sought to combat the prevailing wave of Darwinian skepticism with his novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. A phenomenal success, the book sold an estimated 2 million copies in many languages, including Arabic and Chinese, and later appeared on stage and screen. It was the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the anti-Darwinists, who found it in support of the Holy Scriptures. An even more popular writer was Horatio Alger, a Puritan-reared New Englander who in 1866 forsook the pulpit for the pen. Holy Horatio wrote more than 100 volumes of juvenile fiction that sold over 17 million copies. His stock formula depicted a poor boy new to the city who, through a combination of virtue, hard work, and bravery, achieved success, honor, and middle-class respectability, a kind of survival of the purest, especially non-smokers, non-drinkers, non-swearers, and non-liars. Although accusations of sexual impropriety haunted Alger throughout his life, he implanted in his readers moral lessons and the conviction that there's always room at the top, especially if one is lucky enough to save the life of a boss's daughter and marry her. Literature and the arts were not immune to the era's sweeping changes. Confronted by new cities and industries, American writers and artists forsook the romantic sentimentality of the earlier age and generated 3 interrelated currents into the arts: realism, naturalism, and regionalism. All 3 movements responded to the Gilded Age's urban industrial transformation. Realism quickly came to dominate the post-Civil War American literature. Foregoing romantic pageantry and supernatural melodrama, American authors increasingly found their subjects in the coarse human comedy and material drama of the world around them. William Dean Howells, the celebrated father of American realism, emerged as the era's preeminent advocate of unsentimental literature. A printer's son from Ohio, Howells had scant schoolhouse education, but his busy pen carried him high into the literary circles of the East. In 1871, he became the editor-in-chief of the prestigious Boston-based Atlantic Monthly, where he championed the careers of several young American writers. In no less than 36 novels and nearly 200 books, he wrote about ordinary men and women in familiar surroundings and about contemporary and sometimes controversial social themes. His most famous novel, The Rise of Silas Lapham, describes the moral trials of a newly rich paint manufacturer caught up in the caste system of Brahmin Boston. Other well-known works dealt with the once taboo subject of divorce and the reformers, strikers, and socialists of Gilded Age New York. Two recipients of Howells' patronage and friendship, Mark Twain and Henry James, carried literary realism to new heights. With his meager formal schooling in Frontier, Missouri, the mustachioed Twain typified a new breed of American authors in revolt against the elegant refinements of the old New England school of writing. Christened Samuel Langhorne Clemens, he had served for a time as a Mississippi riverboat pilot and later took his pen name, Mark Twain, from the boatman's cry that meant 2 fathoms. After a 2-week stint in the local Confederate militia, Twain journeyed westward to Nevada and California, a trip he described with a mixture of truth and tall tales in Roughing It. 1 year later, he teamed up with Charles Dudley Warner to write The Gilded Age, an acid satire on post-Civil War political corruption and speculative greed. The book gave a name to an era. Many other books flowed from Twain's busy pen. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer preceded The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, an American masterpiece that defined Twain's own definition of a classic as a book which people praise and don't read. Over the decades, countless readers have been captivated by Huck's and Jim's search for freedom and friendship across the colorful and often racist backdrop of the antebellum Mississippi River Valley. Twain's later years were soured by bankruptcy growing out of unwise investments, and he was forced to take the lecture platform and amuse what he called the damned human race. Journalist, humorist, satirist, and foe of social injustice, he made his most enduring contribution in capturing frontier realism and colloquial humor in the authentic American dialect. Twain's homegrown vernacular met its match in Henry James's elegantly filigreed prose. Brother of Harvard philosopher William James, Henry James was a New Yorker who turned from law to literature and spent most of his life in Europe. Taking as his dominant theme the confrontation of innocent Americans with subtle Europeans, James penned a remarkable number of brilliant realist novels, including The Portrait of a Lady and The Wings of the Dove. His book, The Bostonians, was one of the first novels about the rising feminist movement. James's fiction experimented with the point of view and interior monologue, and he frequently made women his central characters, exploring their inner reactions to complex situations with a deftness that marked him as a master of psychological realism. Long resident in England, he became a British subject shortly before his death. Like her friend James, Edith Wharton took a magnifying glass to the inner psychological turmoil and moral shortcomings of post-Civil War high society. Born into money, Wharton spent her years in the blue-blooded social circles of New York, Newport, and Paris. In 1885, she married well, but not happily, and increasingly turned her energies to writing. Wharton's many novels, including The House of Mirth and The Age of Innocence, exposed the feudal struggles and interior costs of striving characters stuck on the social ladder. Wharton's portrayal of upper-crust social strife verged on naturalism, a more intense literary response than mainstream realism to the social dislocations and scientific tumult of late 19th century America. Sip. Excuse me. Emphasizing the determinative influence of heredity and social environments in shaping character, naturalistic writers sought to apply detached scientific objectivity to the study of human beings, or human beasts in French novelist Émile Zola's famous phrase. While realist authors often treated middle and upper-class characters in everyday settings, naturalist novelists placed lower-class, marginal characters in extreme or sordid environments, including the urban jungle, where they were subject to the cruel operations of brute instinct, degenerate heredity, and pessimistic determinism. Stephen Crane, the 14th child of the Methodist minister, exemplified this naturalistic urge in his writing. His Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, a brutal tale about a poor prostitute driven to suicide, exposed the seamy underside of life in urban industrial America. The novel proved too grim to find a publisher, so Crane had it printed privately. He rose quickly to prominence with The Red Badge of Courage, the stirring story of a bloodied young Civil War recruit, Fresh Fish, under the extreme stress of fire. Crane himself had never seen a battle and wrote entirely from printed Civil War records. Sharing the misfortune of his many characters, he died of tuberculosis in 1900 when only 28. Candid, naturalistic portrayals of contemporary life and social problems were the literary order of the day by the turn of the century. Jack London, famous as a nature writer in such books as The Call of the Wild, depicted a future Fascistic Revolution in the Iron Heel, a book that displayed London's socialistic leanings. Frank Norris, like London, a Californian, wrote The Octopus, an earthy saga of the stranglehold in which railroad and corrupt politicians held California wheat ranchers. A sequel, The Pit, dealt with the making and breaking of speculators on the Chicago Wheat Exchange. Conspicuous among new naturalistic social novelists rising in the literary firmament was Theodore Dreiser, a homely, gangling writer from Indiana. He burst upon the literary scene in 1900 with Sister Carrie, a graphic narrative of a poor working girl adapting to urban life in Chicago and New York. She becomes one man's mistress, then elopes with another, and finally strikes out on her own to make a career on the stage. The fictional Carrie's disregard for prevailing moral standards so offended Dreiser's publisher that the book was soon withdrawn from circulation, though it later reemerged as an acclaimed American classic. Sharing a common documentary impulse with realist and naturalistic fiction, regionalism as a movement sought to chronicle the peculiarities of local ways of life before the coming wave of industrial standardization. By the end of the 19th century, practically every region of the country had its share of local colorists. At first blush, these regionalist writers accentuated the differences among still distant American locales and indulged in a bit of provincial nostalgia. At the same time, however, their work also served to demystify, to some extent, regional differences, especially among national audiences bent on post-war reunification. Twain, London, and Bret Harte, among other Western writers, popularized and often debunked the lusty legend of the Old West. A fabulously dressed New Yorker, Harte struck it rich in California with gold rush stories, especially the luck of Roaring Camp and the outcast of Poker Flat. Catapulted suddenly into notoriety by those short stories, he never again matched their excellence or their popularity. Interest in local color writing about the South also revived in the aftermath of the Reconstruction. Two black writers, Paul Laurence Dunbar and Charles W. Chestnut, brought their distinctive voices to late 19th century literature. Dunbar's poetry, particularly his acclaimed Lyrics of Lowly Life, and Chestnut's fiction, short stories in Howell's Atlantic Monthly and The Conjure Woman, embraced the use of black dialect and folklore, previously shunned by black authors, to capture the spontaneity and richness of Southern black culture. Pioneering women also contributed to the post-Civil War Southern literary scene. Drawing from her experiences as a young bride and businesswoman in Louisiana, the daring feminist author Kate Chopin wrote candidly about adultery, suicide, and women's ambitions in the Awakening. Largely ignored after her death, Chopin was rediscovered by later readers, who cited her work as suggestive of the feminist yearnings that stirred beneath the surface of respectability in the Gilded Age. Some important authors, of course, defied categorization. The gifted Henry Adams, son of Charles Francis Adams, grandson of John Quincy Adams, and great-grandson of John Adams, turned unrivaled family connections into a prolific career as a historian, novelist, and critic. In his nine-volume History of the United States during the administrations of Jefferson and Madison, Adams defended his patrician heritage from posthumous attack. He channeled his alarm at modern trends into his best-known work, The Education of Henry Adams, an autobiographical account of his own failure to come to grips with the chaotic forces of the turn-of-the-century life. Whew. Artistic triumphs. Realism and regionalism, more so than naturalism, also energized the American art world, much as they did the literary sphere. Philadelphia's native son, Thomas Eakins, created a veritable artistic catalog of his hometown's social, scientific, and sporting life at the end of the 19th century. Boston-born Winslow Homer, who as a youth had secretly drawn sketches in school, brought a similar mastery to the pastoral farms and swelling seas of the Northeast. Earthily American and largely resistant to foreign influences, he reveled in rugged realism and boldness of conception. His oil canvases of the sea and its fisher folk were striking. Probably no American artist has excelled him in portraying the awesome power of the ocean. Following in the footsteps of the expatriate writers Henry James and Edith Wharton, prominent American painters working in the realist style made their living abroad. James Whistler did much of his work, including the celebrated portrait of his mother in England. This eccentric and quarrelsome Massachusetts Yankee had earlier dropped out of West Point after failing chemistry. Had silicon been a gas, he later jested, I would have been a major general. Another gifted portrait painter, likewise self-exiled in England, was John Singer Sargent. His flattering but somewhat superficial likeness of the British nobility and America's nouveau rich were highly prized. Mary Cassatt, an American in exile in Paris, painted sensitive portrayals of modern women and children that earned her a place in the pantheon of the French Impressionist painters, whose work revolutionized the European art world after their 1874 debut. The most gifted sculptor yet produced by America was Augustus St. Gaudens. Born in Ireland of an Irish mother and a French father, he became an adopted American. The national urge to commemorate the Civil War brought him a number of famous commissions, including the stirring Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, erected on Boston Common in 1897. It depicts Colonel Shaw, a young white Boston Brahmin officer, leading his black troops into battle in the Civil War. Music, too, was gaining popularity. America of the 1880s and 1890s was assembling high-quality symphony orchestras, notably in Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia. The famed Metropolitan Opera House of New York was erected in 1883. In its fabled Diamond Horseshoe, the newly rich, often under the pretense of enjoying the imported singers, would flaunt their jewels, gowns, and furs. While symphonies and operas were devoted to bringing European music to elite American audiences, new strains of homegrown American music were sprouting in the South, another outgrowth of the regionalist trend. Black folk traditions like spirituals and ragged music were evolving into the blues, ragtime, and jazz, which would transform American popular music in the 20th century. A marvelous invention was the reproduction of music by mechanical means. The phonograph, though a squeakily imperfect instrument when invented by the deaf Edison, had by 1900 reached over 150,000 homes. Americans were rapidly being dosed with canned music as the sitting room piano increasingly gathered dust. Wrenching changes to the nation's cities inspired a new generation of architects and planners to reshape American urban space with the City Beautiful movement. Its proponents wanted the new American city not just to look beautiful, but also to convey a confident sense of harmony, order, and monumentality. To achieve these effects, they copied European styles of Beaux Arts classicism, and planning ideas from the master builder of Paris, Baron Joseph Eugene Haussmann, who in the 1860s had recast the City of Light with grand boulevards, parks, and public buildings. Aiming to assert America's prominence among the greatest urban cultures of the Western world, architects constructed grandiose urban landmarks such as New York's Grand Central Terminal. City planners like Daniel Burnham redesigned Chicago and Washington, D.C. in the belief that they could make them perfect progressive cities, inspiring civic virtue in their inhabitants. To this end, they joined contemporary landscape architects and park builders like Frederick Law Olmsted, who sought to foster virtue and egalitarian values with his designs for New York's Central Park and Boston's Emerald Necklace, as well as the campus of Stanford University, which opened in 1891. Burnham's first major project, which came to symbolize the City Beautiful movement, was his design for the Great World's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1893. His imposing landscape of pavilions and fountains honored the 400th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage. This so-called dream of loveliness was visited by 27 million people, roughly equivalent to 2/5 of the nation's population. The Chicago Exposition did much to raise American artistic standards and promote city planning, although many fairgoers proved more interested in the contortions of the hoochie-coochie dancer named Little Egypt. The business of amusement. Fun and frolic were not neglected by the workaday American. The pursuit of happiness, heralded in the Declaration of Independence, had by the century's end become a frenzied scramble. People sought their pleasures fiercely, as they had overrun their continent and built their cities fiercely. And now they had more time to play. Varied diversions beckoned. The legitimate stage still flourished, as appreciative audiences responded to the lure of the footlights. Vaudeville, with its coarse jokes and graceful acrobats, continued to be immensely popular during the 1880s and 1890s, as were minstrel shows in the South, now performed by black singers and dancers rather than by whites wearing blackface, as in the North before the Civil War. The circus, high-tented and multi-ringed, finally emerged full-blown. Phineas T. Barnum, the master showman who had early discovered that the public likes to be humbugged, joined hands with James A. Bailey in 1881 to stage the greatest show on earth. Colorful Wild West shows, first performed in 1883, were even more distinctively American. Headed by the nightly, goateed, and free-drinking William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, the troupe included war-whooping Indians, live buffalo, and dead-eye marksmen. Among them was the girlish Annie Oakley. Rifle in hand, she could at 30 paces perforate a tossed-up card half a dozen times before it fluttered to the ground. Hence the term Annie Oakley for a punch ticket, and later for a free pass. Baseball, already widely played before the Civil War, was clearly emerging as the national pastime, if not a national mania. A league of professional players was formed in the 1870s, and in 1888 an all-star baseball team toured the world, using the pyramids as a backstop while in Egypt. Basketball was invented in 1891 by James Naismith, a YMCA instructor in Springfield, Massachusetts. Designed as an active indoor sport that could be played during the winter months, it spread rapidly and enjoyed enormous popularity in the next century. Excuse me. A gladiatorial trend towards spectator sports rather than participative sports was exemplified by football. This rugged game with its dangerous flying wedge had become popular well before 1889 when Yale man Walter C. Camp chose his first All-American team. The Yale-Princeton game of 1893 drew 50,000 cheering fans, while foreigners jeered that the nation was getting sports on the brain. Even pugilism, with its long background of bare-knuckle brutality, gained a new glove respectability in 1892. The agile gentleman Jim Corbett, a scientific boxer, wrestled the world championship from the aging and alcoholic John L. Sullivan, the fabulous Boston Strong Boy. The land of the skyscraper was plainly becoming more standardized, owing largely to the new oh my god, I can't read. I'm almost done. The new industrialization. Although race and ethnicity assigned urban Americans to distinctive neighborhoods and workplaces, to an increasing degree, they shared a common popular culture: playing, reading, shopping, and talking alike. As the century drew to a close, the explosion of cities paradoxically made Americans more diverse and more similar at the same time. Wow, chapter 25. Okay, cool.